All right, I'm here with my friend Lukáš. We just read Malone Dies, the second of three novels by Samuel Beckett. Lukáš, what did you think of Malone Dies?
Well, by way of introduction to the book, just a little bit. It doesn't need very much introduction. It basically is about this guy named Malone. He's lying in a bed in some room, possibly in a hospice or an asylum or something, and he's dying. He's slowly dying. And we see some people come in to leave him food or whatever, but basically it's a one-character book. It's the internal monologue of this guy who's dying. And I read this for the first time 8 years ago, as you know, and I remember really finding it a really tough nut to crack back then. This time around, I just absolutely loved it. To me, it was more like a work of prose poetry than a novel. I felt like I was reading it much more like I read poetry or like I listen to music than like I would read Tolstoy or whoever else, other fiction writer I'm reading. And that has to do with both with the kind of unconventional structure, but also just with the beauty of some of the language. Because there were just some heart-stoppingly beautiful passages in this, which heart-stopping is not usually the word I apply to Samuel Beckett. I apply many words to him. I love him. Heart-stopping is not exactly one of the words I usually apply to him. And I felt like parts of a lot of this was not, but parts of it were. So yeah.
I totally agree. How do you feel like it fits in within the trilogy? Because we're going through the trilogy. Our last video was on what's his name again? Malloy.
Malloy and Jacques Moran.
Right.
I kind of felt like this was. I kind of feel like I think I may be quoting actually someone who commented on one of my own videos. So sorry, just a little bit of weird context. I did 3 videos of my own on all 3 of these novels like 8 years ago when I first read them, and I have not I rewatched the first one on Malloy. I have not rewatched the one on Malone Dies.
What was it like rewatching that video?
It's actually fun.
Nice.
I was actually really surprised by how not cringe it was.
That's great.
I didn't use editing software back then too, so it was all in like one unbroken take, which I don't really do anymore. But in the video on Malone Dies, I did go to it and look at the comments, and someone in the comments said that Malone Dies almost feels like it's a continuation of Malloy, right? Like Malloy has perhaps deteriorated even further. And I kind of felt, so I kind of saw a spiritual sequel. It feels like a spiritual sequel, even if it's not what you call a direct sequel. Because it did feel like Malone almost was a like further deteriorated version of Malloy, or possibly Jacques Moran. But as we discussed, Malloy and Jacques Moran may just be the same person or whatever. So and that both has to do with him being unable to stand, it would seem. He's now lying down, whereas Malloy could at least crawl and use crutches to get around. But also, I feel like the solipsism of Malloy has just become way more intense.
Yeah.
And perhaps because he's approaching his own death.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The way I think of it is I think the trilogy is exploring sort of the soundtrack of the mind, like this sort of internal ticking, processing and interpreting like apparatus that's like constantly running, this internal monologue that's running. And in Malloy, that monologue and that interpretive apparatus is applied to the outside world as characters are trying to navigate the outside world, as they're on these odysseys, on these journeys, Malloy and Jacques Moran. And that you see that apparatus in action. And then there's a stripping down of the context as we progress. So like now, from Malone Dies, it's just all that activity, all the external world activity is stripped away. So it's just one person in a bed, and that same mind, that same apparatus is now operating in the space purely of imagination or memory. And again, it's that same kind of energy being explored. And then of course the third book, which we haven't read yet together, but I read a bunch of years ago, The Unnameable, is I think even further stripping down, where again it's the mind still at work, but you're no longer in memory even. You're no longer in the space of imagination. You're just in the space of language. And so there's this I think this process of stripping away, and leaving bare that sort of internal monologue.
Yeah, and I mean, my understanding is that part of what Beckett was trying to do with these novels was the way that I heard it worded was he tried to empty the novel of all of its usual components of plot. I mean, plot is pretty easy to do away with. There have been plenty of plotless novels written, but do away with plot, but then also with character and with setting, right?
Yeah.
And he wanted to empty the novel of these things, but still move the reader and make the reader think. And that'll become all the more radical in The Unnameable, but in Malone Dies, it's still quite starkly on display, and I found it quite moving. Yeah.
Totally. And you can see it just in terms of the plot, like between these three novels. So in Malloy, the both this part one and part two have a plot, but it's like an absurd plot. It's like it's like a ridiculous plot. It's like a plot that doesn't get anywhere. It's a plot that fails, but there's some sort of like motivation. And then in Malone Dies, there is no plot really. It's just someone dying and then sort of narrating that experience and narrating the memories. And then I think again we haven't read The Unnameable yet. When we do, we'll I think express it more. But again, it's still this increasingly unraveling of plot, because there is these there are still characters in Malone Dice, so that remains, but I think in The Unnameable even that is stripped away. So
Yeah, but some of the characters, since you mentioned characters, I'll just latch onto that. Something that I found so, I guess, kind of charming about this novel was that he kind of says that he kind of says it outright. He wants to start inventing stories, basically just to kill time.
Yeah,
sounds like to kill time until he dies. And so a lot of the novel is taken over with the story of this. At first, it seems a young boy, and then a grown man, and then possibly an old man who starts out named Sappho or Sapo. I'm not really sure how it's supposed to be pronounced, but that was an interesting name because it just reminds me of Sappho, the ancient Greek poet. But it starts out as Sappho and then gets renamed to something else. McMahon. Yeah, McMahon. And
there's like one page where he calls him Sappho, like the narrator calls, and he's like, actually, why am I calling him Sappho? He's like switches the name on you.
Yeah. And so a lot of the novel is taken over with this story or stories that he's just inventing about this person who probably didn't exist. But that's the thing, like he just changes the guy's name partway through, although it's unclear if he changes it or if that he forgot it or what.
Yeah,
right. We saw some of those games in Malloy. And what I just found charming, for one thing, what I found charming was how it was just so, again, like in Malloy, I talked about how the way that most normal people tell stories is not in a very linear, crafted way. Right? They do kind of throw in details at awkward moments, maybe forget someone's name and think, oh no, their name was actually this, or misremember details, change details, whatever. And you see a similar thing with that. But also I felt like what was moving about the book was his telling of this story was, again, ostensibly to kind of kill time until he died. And he claims that he wants to die. He claims. And I think through him going on and on about this story, what you start to get the sense of is he really doesn't want to die. He says that he wants to die, but it's against his, I don't want to say it's better judgment, but against his impulses. But what you also see, what a quote that this reminded me of, it's not the quote I mentioned earlier. A quote that I was reminded of, and this is from a book I will confess I have not read, but it's a famous quote. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, right, from Joan Didion. And it felt like he was telling this story just to keep himself going almost. And to a degree, I felt like he wanted it to be an escape from what was going on with him.
Yeah.
And yet, what you start to see as that story continues is details of his own life start to kind of invade his made-up world that's seemingly supposed to be an escape, right? Like the McMahon ends up in a room by himself, just like Malone. He also ages, I think, it's a little bit unclear to me, but it seems like he ages from a young man to at least a middle-aged man, if not an old man. Um, and So I just found that really moving. This man who's dying, who claims to want nothingness, and yet seems to cling to life against his better judgment, and does so by telling this story to get his mind off things, but then what's going on in his life keeps invading the story anyway, you know?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that part of what's being explored is the way that the mind can't help itself. So I thought in Malloy there was a sense that the mind can't help but make these interpretations and come up with these theories, even if they're so useless and so like absurd. And then here, just I think the mind can't help but tell stories and retreat into this imagination, which again, like you said, so I think astutely is like the blending of memory and imagination. And it is obviously not clear even to the reader where one ends and one begins. But clearly that seems to be what's going on. Like he's telling these stories, and clearly there is some autobiographical element seeping in. Yeah.
Yeah. Um. So
Should we do quotes?
yeah, let's.
I thought we'd do quotes. I thought that would sort of be, in my opinion, it's like a good way to sort of, I think, celebrate, like share the novel, enjoy the novel, is through the power of Beckett's language. Um, and so I thought just maybe for most of the video or whatever is left of this video, just we could focus on like going back and forth sharing quotes.
Yeah, definitely.
Do I go first?
Sure. Okay, let me see. All right, I'll read this. It's one of the shorter quotes actually that I have written down, but I'll read it first. Okay, so this is my first quote. Yes, now my mind is easy. I know the game is won. I lost them all till now, but it's the last that counts. A very fine achievement, I must say, or rather would if I did not fear to contradict myself. Fear to contradict myself. If this continues, it is myself I shall lose, and the thousand ways that lead there. And I shall resemble the wretches famed in fable, crushed beneath the weight of their wish come true. And I even feel a strange desire come over me, the desire to know what I am doing, and why. So I near the goal I set myself in my young days, and which prevented me from living. And on the threshold of being no more, I succeeded in being another. Very pretty.
Amazing.
And you know what I was reminded of while reading this? The last author I would ever think to draw parallels with Beckett. What this reminds me of is Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. That's what that reminds me of. When he says, what is a very fine achievement, I might say, or rather would, if I did not fear to contradict myself. Fear to contradict myself, right? And then it continues.
Yeah.
And that famous quote, right, from Song of Myself, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I'm vast, I contain dudes. So.
Yeah.
And again, the last author I thought to be preparing to Beckett. So, yeah.
That's a beautiful quote. Yeah, the language is so powerful there.
Yeah.
And then the meta element to it, because he's writing, he's narrating his thoughts, and there's this constant meta analysis of what he's writing. So like that, even that's so pretty at the end, right? It seems to me that if I understand it correctly, he's saying that his language is like he's like being sarcastic about his own writing, and that's like throughout this sentence, kind of like the level of the language, and the meta analysis or the meta thoughts intruding. Another thing I'll say, by the way, going back to a little bit of context about the story, between the time that I first read it and now, I had a relative pass away of old age. And these things are part of life, and they're natural, and I think a lot of people have that experience at some point. But just there's an accurate description in this book of a kind of inward retreat that happens to people who sometimes, not who knows, can't speak too broadly, but that seems to happen for some people when they die of old age, where they sort of lose their speaking ability, they lose communication in the outside world. There's like this retreat inward. And I think that Beckett is writing from a place of course, his creativity and his mind, but I think he's writing from a place of really trying to penetrate, like, actually the experience of a dying person. And I didn't notice that the first time around, like the amount of, like, I think honest, real interrogation of, like, the real experience of, like, really dying that really happens to people at the end of life. It just felt actually much more real than I had remembered or expected.
Yeah. I mean, I was wondering, you mentioned this to me a couple weeks ago, and after it, I was wondering, like, I don't know if Beckett ever had, like, near-death experience himself or anything like that.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I mean, I know that he was in an asylum for a while because of a mental breakdown he had, but not the same thing, obviously, although possibly influenced the sort of hospice asylum place that the character here is living in. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think a brilliant writer might be able to put himself in the mind of someone who's dying without having had the experience. But then um, again, I just wonder. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about his life. So
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, you.
I'll share a quote. I have a bunch of quotes. One this quote to me it captures again that there's multiple layers in this book. There's like the layer of his narrating his experience in the hospital bed in this sort of asylum, it seems, hospice, versus there's also the layer of his storytelling, which is a different layer of narrative where he's delving into these characters and they're sort of just existing. So this is him narrating his experience being in this bed, and then so this sort of level of narration appears throughout the book, and he's sort of interrogating this question of place, like this question of like what am I, what are my boundaries, what are my borders, and I just thought this was like so profound. So he's talking about the sounds that he hears. He hears cries, steps, doors, murmurs, and then he says softly, he says the little space begins to throb. This is like his experience of being in this room all the time, and he says, "You may say it is all in my head, and indeed sometimes it seems to me I am in a head." And these 6 planes that enclose me are of solid bone. But thence to conclude the head is mine, no, never. A kind of air circulates, I must have said so, and when all goes still, I hear it beating against the walls, and being beaten back by them. And then somewhere in mid-space, other waves, other onslaughts gather and break, whence I suppose the faint sound of aerial surf, that is my silence. And we could stop there. But it's like this interrogation of inwardness, of looking, peering inward and saying, like, where am I? I'm in my skull. And he's like describes the ability to sort of like hear the inside of his skull. And yeah, I mean, it raises the question of like what are our boundaries? Like, are we in our skull? I mean, in some sense we are.
Yeah, like, what is the self to
Right.
you? Like, what's a self? And also, what is consciousness?
Right.
Kind of.
Is consciousness in the skull? You know?
Yeah, yeah. No, that I hadn't somehow picked up on that passage. That's so fascinating. That's very, I mean, ahead of his time, honestly, in many ways. You know, because like cognitive science has become a big field of inquiry since then.
Yeah.
But I don't think it was back then. Would have been in the 1940s when he was writing this, probably.
Yeah.
But cognitive science being, you know, this sort of multidisciplinary study of how the brain creates consciousness.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It feels like he's touching on kind of what cognitive science started to investigate, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, wow.
It's a man in this room, and then in the man is like this brain in the skull. You know, there's like layers of like the self and the self. You know, yeah, I thought that was really really cool. Do you wanna share one?
I can share a longer one. Yeah. And I don't have a ton of substantive comments on it. My comment in my notes is just what poetry?
Yeah.
2 exclamation points.
Yeah.
It's a lengthy passage, so buckle up, but
That's great.
here it is. Live and invent. I have tried. I must have tried. Invent. It is not the word. Neither is live. No matter. I have tried. While within me the wild beast of earnestness padded up and down, roaring, ravening, rending. I have done that, and all alone, well hidden, played the clown, all alone, hour after hour, motionless, often standing, spellbound, groaning. That's right, groan. I couldn't play. I turned till I was dizzy, clapped my hands, ran, shouted, saw myself winning, saw myself losing, rejoicing, lamenting. Then suddenly I threw myself on the playthings, if there were any, or on a child, to change his joy to howling, or I fled to hiding. The grown-ups pursued me, the just, caught me, beat me, hounded me back into the round, the game, the jollity. For I was already in the toils of earnestness. That has been my disease. I was born grave, as others syphilitic, and gravely I struggled to be grave no more, to live, to invent, to know what I mean. But at each fresh attempt I lost my head, fled to my shadows as to sanctuary, to his lap who can neither live nor suffer the sight of others living. I say living without knowing what it is. I tried to live without knowing what I was trying. Perhaps I have lived, after all, without knowing. I wonder why I speak of all this. Ah, yes, to relieve the tedium. Live and cause to live. There is no use in indicting words. They are no shoddier than what they peddle. After the fiasco, the solace, the repose, I began again to try and live, cause to live, be another, in myself, in another. How false all this is. No time now to explain. I began again, but little by little with a different aim, no longer in order to succeed, but in order to fail. Nuance. What I sought when I struggled out of my hole, then aloft through the stinging air towards an inaccessible boon, was the rapture of vertigo, the letting go, the fall, the gulf, the relapse to darkness, to nothingness, to earnestness, to home, to him waiting for me always, who needed me and whom I needed, who took me in his arms and told me to stay with him always, who gave me his place and watched over me, who suffered every time I left him, whom I have often made suffer and seldom contented, whom I have never seen. There I am, forgetting myself again. My concern is not with me, but with another, far beneath me, and whom I try to envy, of whose crass adventures I can now tell at last. I don't know how. Of myself I could never tell, any more than live or tell of others. How could I have, who never tried, to show myself now on the point of vanishing, at the same time as the stranger, and by the same grace, that would be no ordinary last straw. Then live, long enough to feel, behind my closed eyes, other eyes closed. What an end.
Wow, amazing.
I know, that has to be one of my favorite passages I have ever read.
Yeah.
Um, I like, I feel like I could do a line-by-line commentary on different things in it. My favorite line in it, though, is there is no use indicting words. They are no shoddier than what they peddle.
Amazing.
You know, it's that idea that your words are inadequate, of course.
Yeah.
It reminds me actually a little bit of a quote by Nietzsche, your favorite guy ever.
Yeah.
A quote by Nietzsche that Harold Bloom loved to always quote, while Harold Bloom was writing about Hamlet, actually.
Okay.
But it was a quote from Nietzsche where he said, it was from, and I have read this book that I'm quoting from, I believe it's from Twilight of the Idols. And he says something to the effect, I'm gonna paraphrase probably, but that for which we have words is already dead in our hearts. There is a kind of contempt in the act of speaking. You know, it's this idea that if we have been able to actually find words for something, then to some degree it's already dead.
Yeah.
And I think the way that I interpret that is that whenever we put something into words, no one is ever going to interpret it the same way as what we have up in our heads.
Yeah.
Right? Which is a source of endless frustration for me, just in my everyday life when I try to tell people things. But that aside, it reminds me a bit of that. But then what he's saying too is that, yes, well, words are inadequate, a la Nietzsche, but what they're describing is also equally incomprehensible. So why not use the tools we have, I guess?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, totally. That's really powerful. I think that's one of Beckett's like major projects is exploring sort of the inadequacy of language, and the futility of language, and also the incessant nature of language. Like, does language being futile and inadequate, but also just being ubiquitous and ever present and insatiable, and you can't shut up, you know? And the other thing that Malone Dies offers, and that I think that passage explores, is this perspective of like, life is done and you reflect back on a life and like what remains, and it's not like the details. Is like it's absurd is Beckett's answer. I mean, that might not be everyone's answer, but Beckett's answer is like this absurd drama, like the end of Macbeth, out brief candle. Life is like a, you know,
like a walking shadow.
Walking shadow on the stage. Poor player
Ruts and vices hour upon the stage, and the absurd no
more sound of fury
is full of sound and fury,
signifying nothing.
Yeah.
And that's the perspective. Like that's I what I sort of see that sense of like you look back and it's all just absurd. It's all just a play that meant nothing. You know, and I think Malone Dies. I think is partly about that.
Yeah,
That's really beautiful.
great. I know the passage to me reads almost like when I was reading it, it almost felt a little bit like chanting, like
Yeah,
I don't know, like
really poetic. Yeah,
ways I religious almost. Like again, it reminds me a little bit of Whitman, which
yeah.
again, not the comparison I would have thought I would find myself making.
I have a very short quote. Okay, this is describing a scene where McMahon, at one point, this character in the imagination just sort of gets stuck in the rain, and he's like, I think that's the part of the book, or he's just stuck somewhere, and he's not going anywhere. He's just sort of stuck. And there's a very brief. This is like 2 sentences or so, reflecting on this situation. And I think in reflecting on McMahon's situation, and just talking in passing, he really inadvertently reflects on his own situation in this room. And it's like this amazing moment where it sort of jumped out at me. It's like, oh my God, he's really reflecting on himself. Because he says that he's it must be thought he will never move again. He's describing this character McMahon out of this place and attitude. For he is still, but this is the key point, for he has still the whole of his old age before him. So McMahon, he still has old age before him. And then that kind of epilogue, when it is not very clear what is happening, and which does not seem to add very much to what has already been acquired, or to shed any great light on its confusion, but which no doubt has its usefulness, as hay is left out to dry before being garnered.
Hmm.
So he's saying that McMahon has his whole life ahead of him. He has old age, and then he has his final period of life that seems to contribute nothing. It doesn't resolve any of the confusion. And it's that final stage, that stage of dying. That's what he's talking about. It's the final stage of dying. It's this period, this like end period of life where you sort of lose contact with reality to some extent. This end period, which again, I can say from my own experience that between the last time I read this book and now, I saw someone go through that. And he says it's like hay being left out to dry before being garnered. He says
Yeah.
it must have its usefulness.
Yeah, I'm glad you unpacked that because I was like, you might have to read that again. But no, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't know that I have much to comment, but other than that, the hay bales make me think of the hay bales that Monet painted. But
I just love it. I love it. I just feel like he's talking about himself.
yeah,
He's talking about this period of life and this experience. He says that I love how he says it's so absurd and contributes nothing, but it must have some value. I just thought that's so profound.
yeah, yeah. Which I don't know. You could say like what you were just saying a few minutes ago, quoting from Macbeth and the absurd nature of life. I mean, you could extend what he's saying about the end of life to just
Yeah.
all of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's part of what's going on also. Yeah.
Yeah,
For sure.
Cool.
Yeah. One.
Okay. Please. So I will do this next quote.
I love it.
All right. So here it is. My body does not yet make up its mind. Once again, echoing kind of one of the quotes that you read about the brain. My body does not yet make up its mind, but I fancy it weighs heavier on the bed, flattens and spreads. My breath, when it comes back, fills the room with its din, though my chest moves no more than a sleeping child's. I open my eyes and gaze unblinkingly and long at the night sky. So a tiny tot I gazed, first at the novelties, then at the antiquities. Between it and me the pain, misted and smeared with the filth of years. I should like to breathe on it, but it is too far away. It is such a night as Caspar David Friedrich loved, tempestuous and bright. That name comes back to me, those names. The clouds scud, tattered by the wind, across a limpid ground. If I had the patience to wait, I would see the moon, but I have not. Now that I have looked, I hear the wind. I close my eyes, and it mingles with my breath. Words and images run riot in my head, pursuing, flying, clashing, merging endlessly. But beyond this tumult there is a great calm, and a great indifference, never really to be troubled by anything again. I turn a little on my side, press my mouth against the pillow, and my nose crushed against the pillow. My old hair is now, no doubt, white as snow. Pull the blanket over my head. I feel deep down in my trunk, I cannot be more explicit, pains that seem new to me. I think they are chiefly in my back. They have a kind of rhythm. They even have a kind of little tune. They are bluish. How bearable all that is, my God. My head is almost facing the wrong way, like a bird's. I part my lips. Now I have the pillow in my mouth. I have. I suck. The search for myself is ended. I am buried in the world. I knew I would find my place there one day. The old world cloisters me, victorious. I am happy. I knew I would be happy one day. But I am not wise. For the wise thing now would be to let go, at this instant of happiness. And what do? I go back again to the light, to the fields I so long to love, to the sky all astir with little white clouds as white and light as snowflakes, to the life I could never manage, through my own fault perhaps, through pride or pettiness, but I don't think so. The beasts are at pasture, the sun warms the rocks and makes them glitter. Yes, I leave my happiness and go back to the race of men too. They come and go, often with burdens. Perhaps I have judged them ill, but I don't think so. I have not judged them at all. All I want now is to make a last effort to understand, to begin to understand, how such creatures are possible. No, it is not a question of understanding. Of what then? I don't know. Here I go nonetheless, mistakenly. Night, storm, and sorrow, and the catalepsies of the soul. This time I shall see that they are good. The last word is not yet said between me and... Yes, the last word is said. Perhaps I simply want to hear it said again. Just once again. No, I want nothing.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I know. I was profoundly moved by this quote. Sorry, I stumbled a little bit through my reading. It wasn't the best reading, but
Yeah,
yeah.
and it's authentic. I mean, I'm struck by how authentic it is. A time of life when there is nothing but your bet, in a way, right? I mean, it might sound foreign to some people or sound, whatever, but it's a real part of human life for some people, and in this final stage of life. And he just described like being like consumed by the world, right? When he's like sucking on his pillow, it's like that's all there is in his experience at that moment.
And I love the image of the pane, the window pane between him and the sky, and how he says it's smeared with the filth of years, and he would like to see his breath on it.
Yeah, amazing.
And then he mentions Caspar David Friedrich, which was the reference to the painter was so left field. I would not have expected Caspar David Friedrich to pop up here, but it is a very painterly passage. The imagery is just so beautiful, which is what made me say that I feel like this work is almost more like poetry than fiction.
Yeah. And it's like this big mystery at the core of it, right? This mystery of like human beings, of like mankind. Like, what is this play of human life? And there's no answer to that. He says like he wants to figure it out. And it's like, actually, that's not even right. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, he doesn't even have the words to describe it. It's just like a ultimate question mark that is just sort of like suffuses experience. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll read a quote again. I think this follows nicely. I think. We're with McMahon again. We're narrating this character of McMahon, and this again I felt was extremely poetic, very philosophical, and again true to the mystery of human nature and the mystery of human psychology and human experience. And I feel like this is Beckett speaking deep truths about human nature that are rare to find. He says, narrating McMahon, the idea of punishment came to his mind. Addicted it is true to the chimera, and probably impressed by the posture of the body and the fingers clenched as though in torment. And without knowing exactly what his sin was, he felt full well that living was not a sufficient atonement for it, or that this atonement was in itself a sin, calling for more atonement, and so on. as if there could be anything but life for the living. And no doubt he would have wondered if it was really necessary to be guilty in order to be punished, but for the memory, more and more galling, of his having consented to live in his mother, than to leave her. And this again he could not see as his true sin, but as yet another atonement, which had miscarried, and far from cleansing him of his sin, plunged him in it deeper than before. And truth to tell, the ideas of guilt and punishment were confused together in his mind, as those of cause and effect so often are in the minds of those who continue to think. We'll stop there.
Yeah, no, somewhere in my notes, somewhere here I have that same quote actually. I mean, it also makes me think of I've heard some kind of psychoanalytic thinkers have argued that like something that's at the heart of the human experience is when we're born, we kind of feel like we were ripped from this safe feeling of wholeness in the womb, I guess, if you want to take it literally. And so when we're in the world, we feel a kind of incompleteness,
right?
Because we were ripped away from a former state of wholeness. And that also could manifest as guilt, as like, maybe I did something to deserve being ripped away from that feeling of wholeness. You also connect it to, again, citing someone else whose work I have not read, but I have read about it. Okay, actually, I've read a little bit of his work, but I have read about it. I mean, Martin Heidegger talked about the people's thrownness, how we're all sort of thrown into the world against our will, like we didn't ask to be born.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I think this book is an exploration of that thrownness to some extent.
Yeah. That's
good. Okay, so maybe before you go, I'll do one other short quote. I thought I enjoyed this quote a lot. I feel like this is more comical. This is like a quote that sort of made me laugh. But it's like sort of absurdist humor that Beckett is such a master of. So this is close towards the end of the book. McMahon at this point is like in a sort of asylum, which is parallel, of course, to our narrator. And McMahon is sort of narrating his experience in this asylum. So he says, McMahon sometimes wondered what was lacking to his happiness. So he describes all the things that McMahon has. The right to be abroad in all weathers, morning, noon, and night. Trees and bushes with outstretched branches to wrap him round and hide him. Food and lodging, such as they were free of all charge. Superb views on every hand out over the lifelong enemy. A minimum of persecution and corporal punishment. The song of the birds. No human contact except Lemuel, who went out of his way to avoid him. The faculties of memory and reflection, stunned by the incessant walking and high wind, Maul dead, what more could he wish? I must be happy, he said. It is less pleasant than I should have thought. I just thought that was very funny.
Yeah, no, that's good. Another kind of Waiting for Godot moment, actually. Because there's a great moment in Waiting for Godot, I think, where I forget who says what, but one of them's like, oh, maybe we should just be happy. And the other, oh, okay, let's be happy. It's like, okay, we're happy now.
I can see we're happy.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, so what happens now that we're happy?
We're happy.
Well, I guess we just wait for Godot,
Yeah.
It's a moving, but also a really funny moment. I'm waiting for Godot that reminds me of that.
Yeah, I thought that was very funny. Yeah, I think that's that parallels spot on for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so this passage that I think we're going to close with is one of the passages, we haven't really touched on this, but there are a few points in this book where you'll have a lengthy passage that sort of ends mid-sentence.
Yeah. Oh, up to yep.
Yeah, and I found often that when those happened were when we're in really kind of intense and often really beautiful moments where you felt like it was building up to something really profound and insightful, and it's just like, oh, sorry, my pencil broke or something.
I fell out of my bed or something.
Which actually, I'm also, just before I read my quote, I'm glad that you bring up a humorous moment in this, because Malone Dies, I think, is less funny than Malloy.
Yeah.
But it has a reputation for not really having much humor that Malloy had. But there are a few moments.
Yeah.
There are a few moments of that Beckett humor. And yeah. So anyway, but my last quote, I don't think is that humorous, but I think it's really, I was really moved by this moment. So I'll read it out. All is pretext. Sappho and the birds, Maul, the peasants, those who in the town seek one another out and fly from one another. My doubts, which do not interest me, my situation, my possessions, pretext for not coming to the point, the abandoning, the raising of the arms and going down, without further splash, even though it may annoy the bathers. Yes, there is no good pretending. It is hard to leave everything. The horror-worn eyes linger abject on all they have beseeched so long, and a last prayer, the true prayer at last, the one that asks for nothing. And it is then a little breath of fulfillment revives the dead longings, and a murmur is born in the silent world, reproaching you affectionately with having despaired too late. The last word in the way of viaticum. Let us try it another way. The pure plateau.
Yeah.
And then it breaks off there in the middle after the pure plateau. But I found that line, and it is then a little breath of fulfillment revives the dead longings, and a murmur is born in the silent world, reproaching you affectionately with having despaired too late.
Mm-hmm.
I like reproaching you affectionately, like just being gentle with you. But having despaired too late, that was almost a gut punch, you know.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, I've never been on my deathbed, obviously.
Yeah.
But I wonder how many people who've been in that position have, so to speak, despaired too late, almost. You know.
Yeah. Beckett is playing with us, I think, throughout Malone Dies, and another works as well. I think of also Craps Last Tape. There's a similar kind of a game going on where he gives you like the most beautiful prose that you like would love, and he just like he's happy to just say like slam the book on you. Like this is not the point. Like this is not it. This is not what the book is about. The book is about the physicality of like this guy in his bed. Like it's like he can like raise his prose to this register of like poetry and like profundity, but he like refuses to give you what you're looking for. He refuses to admit that this is actually profound, in a way.
But he still titillates you,
Right.
with it.
Right.
And I think, yeah, I can see what you're saying. That I mean, maybe my reading is a little bit less cynical.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose. Because I think, I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say. I think he does believe in the beauty of language and the importance of it. I feel like what you're saying with wanting to slam the book on it, say this isn't the point. I think maybe I interpret that more as Beckett portraying the impulses of the character than necessarily that being what Beckett himself thinks.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I think there's more than one way to see it, but I think it's relevant that Beckett puts these words in the mouths of characters who are very lost in a way. They're lost in reality. They're lost in their mind. They're because you would expect to sort of read this kind of poetry in the the mouth of a father Zosima, like a wise sage character, who like is giving you with it, and we know as readers that Beckett could write those characters if he wanted to, brilliant, but he doesn't write those characters. He writes these vagabond characters. He writes characters who are dying and are losing contact with reality, and they're the ones who speak, in that register.
Yeah.
And they do it like by accident, inadvertently, when they just drop their pencil away. Not saying it, and there's when they can't write, nothing like that.
For sure.
Yeah. I'm happy to end it here, unless there's anything else you want to close on. Any thoughts?
I think that's plenty. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel.
From my perspective, this I think was a really beautiful, very enjoyable exploration of the book. I'm very excited for the Unnameable now. When I finished Malloy, I was actually dreading a little bit to go into Malone Dies and the Unnameable. I was like, these are much harder, but actually now I feel rejuvenated. Maybe I'll regret that. Maybe I'll lose that kind of energy. But anyway, so this has been a lot of fun. I'm excited for book 3.
I am pumped for the Unnameable, actually, too. I feel the same way. I was a little bit nervous about Malone Dies and the Unnameable, but now I'm really excited to get to start reading the Unnameable. So, yeah.
Thank you for watching.